بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نرحب بكم في هذه الجلسة. نتناول اليوم في هذه الجلسة موضوعاً.
In this session, we are going to delve on an important issue about the right to expression and in preserving the journalists in exercising criticism by revealing the truth and presenting the facts to the people. Today, we are going to talk about SLAPP and to resort to certain legal texts in order to oppress the journalist. And we would like to welcome in our session today Mr. Khalid Khlifat, the lawyer specialized in the media cases, and we would like to welcome the lawyer in human rights, Carlos Gallo, and he is also the executive director of Media Defense, which is presenting and providing legal assistance to the journalists and different media outlets. At the outset, Mr. Khalid, what are these SLAPP and how these are being used? At the beginning, I would like to welcome our guest and my colleague, Mr. Carlos. I am happy to be among this elite group of media persons and lawyers, and we would like to emphasize that the right to expression is an inherent right to a human being, and hence preventing people from this right under the illegal pretext is the one of the violations that are being committed, or the worst types of violations that are committed against media persons, including the seizure of their equipment or arbitrary arrest or censoring. Many of these are being committed under the excuse of law. There are two types of arbitrary litigation, or the SLAPP and the arbitrary judiciary. There is a big difference between them. One is the use of the right of litigation in order to prosecute the journalist without a legitimate cause. And those that prosecute the journalist pretend that this right has been given to them by the international conventions and treaties, because they have resorted to the law, knowing that what they are doing is something wrong. But the arbitrary judiciary is to use the legal system in a way that violates justice, and there is a big difference between both of them. The second one is more dangerous than the first one. The first one is use the right to prosecute the journalist, but if there is a fair judiciary, and we're not talking about a certain country, this happens around the world and not in a specific region. If there is a fair and just judiciary, we do not have a problem, even if the arbitrary litigation might limit the freedom of expression and might affect the work of a journalist. But it is the fair and just judiciary that will be protecting the journalist. Among the forms of those litigations or lawsuits is that many journalists might be accused or malicious accusations under the title of defamation or inciting hate speech or terrorism. And we have a long list of crimes which the journalist can be accused of. And I'm sorry to say that crimes, in particular in the MENA region, those media cases are considered criminal cases, unlike the first world countries or the European countries that deal with the media cases as being civil cases. The journalist over there might be ordered to compensation and will not be put in prison. And one of the forms of arbitrary persecution could be used against the journalist. Unfortunately, part of that system are the laws, the media laws, which are still scattered over here and there. For example, not less than 10 to 15 laws are utilized in order to prosecute the journalists. We hope that one day we can have a unified law that can regulate the work of media and will be limiting the SLAPP and those that file lawsuits against the journalist are betting on different factors or different reasons. One of them is the lack of financial capability of the journalist to appoint a lawyer. And unfortunately, we as lawyers, sometimes we look for fame, but our main purpose is to earn fees. So the inability of the lawyers, of the journalists to afford lawyers, and also sometimes that they work for a certain agency that will not accept to appoint lawyers for them. And this will be a reason in order for them to keep their mouths shut. I don't think that we have, for example, an official that is looking for financial compensation from the journalist. The purpose is just to keep him, to keep his mouth shut and not disable him from revealing the truth. There are different recommendations which could be suitable in order to limit the legal prosecution under what is called the SLAPP or the right to litigation, and also how can we not violate justice using the law in case, for example, there were fair trials. For example, the journalist might have committed that act, but there are certain models or cases of journalists that have not been treated fairly in the court and have not received a fair trial. Can this be based on legal text? And this is part of the whole system. The legislations with regard to the media are part of the prosecution, and hence, if there are certain laws that limit the cases of litigation, i.e. to use this right in an arbitrary manner, the position of the journalist will be better, and those that might think of prosecuting the journalist before getting into that effort and before that cost, they might think about it twice. Whenever there are guarantees to safeguard the freedom of expression, this will be protecting journalists. You in media defense, you have a long experience in that. Could you tell us about your experience and how you have started, and how do you provide legal assistance, your method of work?
Yes, thank you very much, Ithar. Thank you, Khalid. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to ARIJ for the invitation to join the conference this year. I come from Media Defense, and we are an organization based in London that was set up 16 years ago exactly to tackle or to face the types of problems that Khalid was talking about, lawsuits, the misuse of the law against journalists who publish on the public interest. And since we were created in 2008 until now, we've grown, and we're more well known. And we work in three separate ways which join up together to make a comprehensive way of tackling legal threats to journalists. Media Defense provides support to journalists when they're sued all over the world, and our motto is that we provide this support where the need is highest. Therefore, we work mostly in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Very little in Western Europe or the United States, for instance, where there is a culture of pro bono that is easily available to journalists. We also litigate, conduct in strategic litigation to tackle or to challenge legal provisions, criminal laws that are used to silence and harass journalists around the world. So we have a body of work, which I'll mention some of the interesting cases that we have been doing recently, and I think it could be useful to think about that in the Middle East. And we try to enhance the capacity of lawyers and local organizations to face these threats at the local level. So we fund and support 20 local organizations around the world, and we conduct trainings or workshops with lawyers so that they are better prepared, and we create a network of lawyers to face these sorts of lawsuits against journalists, whatever they are. For instance, we are for the first time conducting a workshop for lawyers in the Middle East today and tomorrow here, and thanks ARIJ for that. So that you have a perspective, a global perspective of the impact of SLAPPs against public interest journalism. Since we were created in 2008, Media Defense has already supported over 2,000 cases, 2,000 lawsuits since its creation. Over the last year, in 2024, we've supported more than 200 new cases just this year, which is an absolute record for us. And according to our measurements, roughly between 25 and 30% of these cases could be considered SLAPPs. So it's quite a threat to journalism that so many public interest journalists are facing legal threats. Exactly the reason is exactly what Khalid says, to try and silence and harass them, not necessarily to receive compensation for damage to the honor of a famous or an important business person, but to try and create an embarrassment and to stop the journalists from publishing. And we try and tackle these on the three ways that I mentioned earlier. Our work in the Middle East as well is growing, and we're very keen on supporting more journalists. We know it's an extremely difficult region for journalists to work on, very dangerous. We don't need to mention the conflicts happening around Jordan at the moment, but even in peace times, the number of arbitrary detentions, violence, torture, imprisonment of journalists is very high in the Middle East, and we're very, very aware of this. And the way we try and tackle systemically these threats is through strategic litigation. So we choose emblematic cases where we can help local lawyers to bring these cases to international attention, so that by serving justice to individual journalists, we'll also be able to create precedents that can be used in that country, in that region, and also in other jurisdictions. And just as examples of what we've been doing to illustrate, I think, the approach that we take, I'll mention 3 or 4 cases that I think could be more relevant. The first one, or 2 cases, relates to armed conflict, and I think that's very close to the reality in the Middle East at the moment, which are cases involving journalists killed, one journalist killed by Russia during the conflict in Ukraine, and another journalist who was kidnapped and tortured by Russian forces in Kharkov, also in Ukraine. We're representing their families and the journalist who was tortured at the European Court of Human Rights to try and get justice for the crimes that committed against them. In Vietnam, we have a body of work supporting journalists who are arbitrarily detained regularly because of their public interest reporting. And these are very brave bloggers who publish on their own, usually on Facebook, for instance, who are rounded up and tried sometimes in a matter of hours. I'll mention the case of Trong Doi Nhat, a journalist who fled Vietnam, went to Thailand. He was a victim of rendition in 2019, returned to Vietnam, went through a sham trial and was in detention. We took his case to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, who in 2020 issued a very good opinion establishing that what happened to Trong Doi Nhat was a violation of his human rights responsible on behalf of Vietnam. And perhaps less violent, but no less dangerous, I would mention some of the digital rights cases that we've been doing lately, that also have a very strong, I think, echo in the Middle East. The first of them is the abuse of spyware, the use of spyware against journalists and public interest watchdogs. We are now representing more than 20 journalists at the European Court of Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Committee, journalists who were targeted by Pegasus since 2020, and after the revelations by Forbidden Stories in 2021, we were able to conduct these cases at the national level, and these cases are already pending before a regional court. We're developing other cases in Africa. We participated in a case in Asia as well, and are developing more cases in Latin America. And finally, also relevant to the region is the issue of internet shutdowns or restrictions to the use of the internet. We were the first organization to litigate a case before a regional court, and we won a case against Togo at the ECOWAS Court of Justice in 2021. And since then, we've done other cases against Guinea, recently against Senegal. And what we want to do with that is establish precedents, case law that can be used in other regional courts and other national contexts to help local organizations, journalists, human rights lawyers to fight against this abuse by governments submitting their population to a restriction to the access to the internet. So these are some of the cases that I thought could be relevant to illustrate what we do and the type of work that we are conducting. In terms of the cases or the countries we support cases in the Middle East, recently we've been involved or supporting lawyers representing journalists in Yemen, Jordan, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, and Palestine, for instance. And these cases refer mainly to arbitrary detention. As I said, we all know it's a big problem in the region, criminal defamation, the use of national security to imprison journalists for very flimsy reasons. The use of fake news legislation and media regulation is something, it's a phenomenon that is growing all over the world. Governments more and more are using legislation to restrict how organizations can operate and how journalists can conduct their own business. And we are there to support them, to challenge these laws, to challenge these arbitrary detentions, and it's something that we would be happy to continue doing now in the future.
Okay. إذا أردت أن أسأل الآن بالنسبة
I need to ask now about Jordan or the Arab region in general. Carlos talked about the efforts made by their institution in providing legal support post the occurrence of any or after getting into the judiciary. How can we address protection? How can there be efforts placed to prevent such litigation? In other words, we don't have to wait until it takes place. There needs to be efforts at all levels so that we have this kind of these cases at minimal. We can't prevent the judiciary or the arbitrary cases. They are there. Whoever wishes to silence the journalists would not leave a chance to follow all the methods, but from their own perspective as freedom oppressors, they think that the best methods that would make them look like modern humans is to resort to the law or to the judiciary to prosecute the journalists. However, silencing the journalists can take place in different manners, including kidnapping, arresting or maybe confiscating their equipment, terminating their jobs. The problem starts once they are arrested. If we're talking about the international civil rights, Article 17, a fair trial should start the minute a journalist is arrested, and of course the following procedures. The first procedure, I believe that the journalists have to be aware of their constitutional and professional rights, meaning that the first step as human rights and freedom of expression defenders we need to provide awareness, legal awareness to the journalists so that they could understand their duties and rights. And then we can take the next steps, because not all journalists have the ability to seek legal support or assistance. Not all the institutions have their own lawyers to defend the reporters or the journalists. So the first step is to raise the awareness of journalists, and not as opposed to training programs, because trainings have proven that their impact would end as they end. I mean by awareness is that the journalists must have an understanding and knowledge about their duties or tasks based on their local institutions and local legislations and regulations. They have to have a lawyer to defend them, to make them aware of their rights. What comes next, and I'm talking here about the simplest applications or objectives. The awareness, raising the awareness of journalists is like the simplest objective, and then to empower specialized lawyers to defend the journalists. This is not a bad thing to say that there are many lawyers who practice or who defend, who do the legal work to the media. And let them allow me, I don't know all of them, but they don't have the sufficient or adequate skills or knowledge to take or to provide legal assistance to the journalists. Media cases, even if they come under criminal cases, journalists are not criminals. This profession is a high, special, invaluable one, and even in terms of the publications or those who are specialized on publications, they know that a journalist is not at the court because he is a killer or a criminal. He is there because he said the truth, and to say the truth was the motivation that brought him to this place. So the next step is to empower the lawyers to prepare specialized lawyers to defend the journalists, and then to prepare also specialized judges to look into the publications and media cases. At a local level here in Jordan, based on the publications law, we have a specialized judicial room specialized in the publications, and this has certainly contributed to making true and correct decisions about the media, and also contributed to raising the awareness of the journalists to become able to defend themselves before specialized judges. The specialized judges should also be aware of of those lawyers and their capacities. The fourth step is to improve the local regulations and legislations to go in line with the constitutions, and the constitutions also need to be redrafted or modified without any exceptions. The majority Arab constitutions address the freedom of expression, but made this an exception that it has to be based on the law. Every person has the right to expression based on the law, as if the constitution is referring freedom to the laws or to the restrictions within the law. So it's a series of procedures. I think most of the Arab countries has gone far in terms of the legislation. They've done a good job, but there's a difference between the theory and applications or execution. In other words, the laws are something and the practical reality is a different thing. The reality is connected or is related to the surroundings and the political situation, and their main objective, of course, is to silence the journalists and prevent them from conveying the truth. So you're talking about working at different levels in order to protect the journalists against this such trials or litigations. We'll open the floor for questions. We have questions from the virtual, but we would first give the priority to the audience here. Do you have any questions?
في البداية شكرا جزيلا على هذه.
To start with, thank you for this session. I'm Raghaba Alwin, Director of Be and Check platform in Tunisia. I was attracted through the session by the talk about the rights of journalists. Unfortunately, and sometimes, and I'm sharing my own experience, journalists are not aware of their rights, perhaps due to the lack or maybe fear, lack of awareness or maybe fear. To me, working with a group of journalists, especially within the political framework that Tunis experienced today, to speak about such rights enjoyed by the journalists. My question is to both of you. Thank you for your introduction. My question is, how can we facilitate this for the journalists, and how can we increase awareness about such rights? As you spoke, you said that there are rights, but when it comes to my own experience, there is an awareness, but there is fear. How can we overcome the fear barrier that could be with some journalists? Trying to understand the question. So, Carlos, if you wish to answer her question. She was talking about protection. We're in the same page. But how can the journalists be protected in general? This sort of litigation. So we would start with either one of you. Carlos, would you wish to answer this or to comment?
Thank you. I'll try my best. It's very difficult. It's a very difficult question to how to ensure security and protection for journalists, especially in an authoritarian country, right, where the police is monitoring, the police is aware of their movements and their actions. So it's different from a democracy, for instance. And our cardinal rule is never to make things worse for either the journalist or the lawyer. Sometimes the lawyers we work with also get into trouble, and in a few instances they had to flee their countries because they were at risk. So this is a conversation that we always have with the journalists we support or the journalists we represent in court. It's whether it is safe to do so, whether filing that case or arguing, presenting an argument in such a way won't put them in danger. If it will, then probably best not to do it at that moment and wait if possible. So this is a conversation that needs to be done or needs to be had with each individual journalist and the context where they are. Other factors that are at play, and I think this is another reason why the Middle East, not so much North Africa, because North Africa can access the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, at least. So there is a venue to evacuate disputes and to try and achieve justice. But there is no regional court in the Middle East, which makes it very difficult for anyone from the Middle East to seek justice if they don't have it served properly within with their domestic courts. So that's why I mentioned it's important to liaise with lawyers on the ground, sometimes with journalists as well. And another aspect of the work that we do is that if the journalist is alone and they don't know a lawyer, normally the journalists will know a lawyer, will trust a lawyer in their own country, someone they're comfortable with. But if they don't, we may be able to find or recommend a lawyer to help them in a specific case, and we'd be happy to do so. And working with these lawyers, we can then find a solution or find a way forward to defending that journalist if it's at all possible, and if we won't put them at risk. This is, I think, very important. In terms of physical security, digital security, I guess there are plenty of organizations around who are able to provide that support. Specifically, we are limited to legal support, but we'd be happy to discuss and to point you in the right direction if necessary. Yeah.
According to my understanding of the question, and please correct me, how can we protect journalists against legal prosecutions, whether arbitrary or non-arbitrary? The main thing is to prepare a journalist, a good journalist, enabled, empowered, educated, and aware. A journalist doesn't have to be a legal person or a lawyer so as to avoid the judiciary or the arbitrary cases or prosecution. As long as we have an empowered, enabled journalist who understands the risk of their job, there would be more awareness and thus the legal prosecution would become less. Sometimes the journalists, please allow me to say that, we have notable journalists here due to for the sake of reputation. A journalist might post a news item without verifying or this piece of news, and they would be subjected thus to legal prosecution. They might ask for legal assistance or advice, but would never access it. If there is no well-practiced professional journalist, that legal prosecution would never stop. After that, you need to offer or to provide legal advice or legal protection. Some journalists rely on their professional experience or on their work, the period they have been working in the journalism. For example, after 15 years of working in press, they consider themselves like semi-lawyers. They don't have to consult with a lawyer, and because they are quite aware of the legal situation, and they would behave or take action without resorting to a legal opinion. Today, the laws are scattered. There are too many, and they're not controlling the media work, particularly in the Arab world, starting with the penal code, going to the cyber crimes, and to the protection of personal data. So the more we advance, the more we have laws and less penalties. We have a question from the audience, from the virtual audience, for both guests. Are there successful examples of journalists who have been able to do these litigations or cases or suits? It's written in English, so I need to make sure that I'm translating it correctly. Carlos, you talked about examples where there any happy ending to these examples that you shared, and then we'll go to the differences to Mr. Khalifat to speak about. But we start with you, Carlos, to answer the question.
Thank you, Aithar. Yes and no. So there are very good examples, and what's missing perhaps is the full implementation of the judgments in question. There's a recent example that is very positive that we are very happy to have supported the case seeking justice for the killing of journalist Arshad Sharif. Arshad Sharif was a Pakistani journalist who fled Pakistan because he was threatened. He moved to Kenya. In October 2022, he was killed at a roadblock in very suspicious circumstances, and no investigation took place. So we supported his lawyer, Ochil Dudley, to carry out a judicial review, and he won the case at the first instance court, ordering the government to pay compensation and to carry out a full investigation over Arshad Sharif's death. That was a very, very important precedent. The internet shutdown cases that I mentioned earlier, we won a case against Togo, we won a case against Guinea as well, both at the ECOWAS Court of Justice. We're waiting a decision on a case against Senegal. So that's to say there are important precedents, there are victories, is not only losses and fear. So it is important to keep fighting, it is important to consult your lawyer and file a case. Our rate of success before regional courts, at media defense at least, is close to 80%. So 80% of all the cases we litigate before international courts reach a successful or positive decision. Not so much before domestic courts. That's obviously a different ballgame altogether. But we see that there is an effort on the part of the community, and I think what Khalid mentioned earlier about consulting the lawyer and the experience of the journalist in publishing their story is also crucial. But sometimes you see that even in democracies, there will be abuse of due process, of the legal process. And we see a number of lawsuits that are filed against journalists in meritless lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits that only want to create embarrassment to them, whatever they are. And it's important to mount a defense. And often it's the case that these types of SLAPPs end up in either the plaintiff withdrawing the case or with a judgment against the plaintiff in favor of the defendant, of the journalist in that case. So it's important, and there are many successful stories. So our website contains a number of successful stories. We try and publicize the good decisions when they come out, so I invite you to check them out.
هذه أخبار جيدة إلى حد ما. خالد، هل هناك دعاوى؟ السؤال.
Khalid, are there cases of journalists who've been able to win those cases eventually, and no legal procedures were taken against them, whether in Jordan or in the region as a whole? I can remember or recall some areas, or as an example for arbitrary cases, I have been also given the authority to represent are very few. The majority cases were either based on legal reasons or on actions committed by the journalists. From the viewpoint of the complainant, they were like defamation against the journalists. From the journalist viewpoint, they were practicing a legal right, and they have the right to update the public about a certain information, and the judiciary was honestly fair. An arbitrary case, one of the journalists died, and he published a news item quoting from an official. He was detained 3 days, and then the case was, the file was closed because the court was a military court. This is just an example or a case. Another case, prosecuting a journalist was prosecuted by a military court, and I believe they reached an understanding, and the case was closed as well. Now, the idea is that arbitrary prosecution or judicial prosecution is not as much as that we could imagine, because we're facing 2 systems, a bloody one and another that uses the law for prosecution. The bloody one is they can just prosecute and do the worst crimes against the journalists, whereas the other one uses the law to prosecute them. So even for like simple cases, and they're really very few. I'm not trying to sell myself. My own experience with ARIJ could be the best witness. I have Reem Abu Hassan, Her Excellency Reem Abu Hassan is quite aware of that. Our legal matters, thank God, we have never been prosecuted arbitrarily, only once. And the judiciary was really fair towards us. That's one of like dozens of investigations that you yourself supervise, so we are in a good shape. Thank you. So we're talking about the importance of awareness. We have one more question because we're running out of time. Let's.
أنا أمة الرحمن
العفوري, an independent journalist from Yemen. My question is, are there legal tools or instruments accessible to the journalists to protect themselves against unjustified judicial cases or litigations?
Yes, there are, but not necessarily I think the journalist can get trained, can learn about how to write a report to protect him or herself from litigation or from a lawsuit. I think that's beyond my expertise. That's for journalism, not for a lawyer to tell you about it. But in case you are threatened with a letter saying that you will be sued if you don't retract your publication, or you were notified of a case, of a lawsuit against you, then there are organizations that can provide support. Media Defense is one of them. We work globally, and we'll be able to help advising, connecting to a lawyer who then should, as a matter of urgency, look at the case and take action. We've seen a number of times, especially independent journalists or freelance journalists, and they make up 75% of the journalists we support are freelance and independent journalists. The remaining are small independent outlets. When the journalists didn't know what to do and simply they ignored the notification from the court about the lawsuit. So they were convicted, they lost the case because they didn't know what to do, they didn't react correctly. So we always advise to consult a lawyer and to try and seek a lawyer and help before things get worse by a judgment being issued without a defense.
خالد، يمكن بتجربتك مع أريج سؤال زميلتنا الأدوات التي يمكن
Regarding the tools that can help or support a journalist, are there any instruments or any advice in this respect? Advice just to take it, to slow down, to prepare a good journalist, to qualify a journalist. The institution is not the only side who is responsible for rehabilitating or for qualifying a journalist. And for example, the size of Al Jazeera or BBC, they might provide much to the journalists, to their journalists, so as to make them to be professional or well experienced, whereas there are other media outlets who can provide very little compared to these institutions. So to start with, a journalist has to be well prepared, has to be qualified for the journalism or the press work too. I think the idea is about relying on a person or the self-reliance because they think they don't need legal support or advice. I believe this would subject the institutions to legal problems. Of course, solidarity campaigns with the journalists, amending the laws, etc., and all these things that can reduce the arbitrary cases.
أعتقد إنه زاهمنا الوقت، لكن
I believe that we ran out of time. Maybe after the session, you can contact the colleagues and take their emails and ask them any questions you might have. We are going to conclude the session, but we are going to have a very important lessons learned from that session, which is awareness and awareness and awareness, and that the good journalist must be aware of his or her rights and well versed about the different laws and also the necessary ethical practices in coverage. We would like to thank you for attending that session, and we would like to thank Mr. Khalid Khalifat and also Mr. Carlos Gallo, the Executive Director for Media Defense and the lawyer. Thank you for your attendance.